At the end of the week, you should be able to identify to be verbs. Last week, you learned about action verbs, and you've been trying on action verbs in your writing all week long. You're not going to forget about action verbs this week, even though you're learning about another type of verb, to be verbs. You're going to still rely on action verbs heavily in your writing. 2, by the end of the week, you need to write sentences using to be verbs both as a link to additional information about the subject and with an action verb. And 3, you're going to use to be verbs sparingly in your writing. So what I mean by sparingly is like not a lot. You should have very few to be verbs in your writing. Sometimes they're more effective than action verbs. However, pretty rarely. Okay, let's get started. So I want to start by looking at the difference between action verbs and to be verbs, and I'm using a book that I'm currently reading called Cinder. It's a fantasy novel. It's fantastic, so you should try it on, but I'm going to use sentences from that novel. So let's look at an action verb sentence first. Her knuckles ache from forcing the screwdriver into the joint. So who or what is doing the action? Knuckles. What are knuckles doing? They're aching. Let's look at a to be verb sentence. The screw from Cinder's ankle was rusted. So my subject is ankle, but what is ankle doing? What's the action? There isn't. The ankle just was. Was is going to be my to be verb. And what I want you to notice is that to be verbs are going to express a state of being. Like they just are. They're just like sitting there being rested. It's expressing a state of being. The ankle was. The hairline threads were stripped clean. So my subject is the threads. Hairline is going to be an adjective. You'll learn about adjectives next week. So threads were stripped clean. What are the threads doing? They just were. Again, it's expressing a state of being. Let's look at some action verbs. She struggled to loosen the screw, one gritting twist after another. So she is my subject. What is she doing? She's struggling. We're going to be tempted to say that to loosen is an action verb as well. However, to loosen is doing something else in this sentence, but it's not acting as an action. The action that she's doing is struggling. She wrenched the screw free with her prosthetic steel hand. So she is going to be my subject. And what is she doing? She's wrenching. Okay, so I want to come over and look at these final two to be verb sentences, and I want you to identify the subject and the verb of these sentences. So Cinder was the only full-service mechanic at New Beijing's weekly market, and her booth was in a shady cover between a used NetScreen dealer and a silk merchant. So what I'm going to ask you to do is in your composition notebook to write these two sentences down and to identify the subject and the verb of these two sentences. So pause the video now. Okay, so we're going to unpause the video. At this point, you should have identified Cinder as our subject and was as our verb. She just was the only full-service mechanic. Was is expressing a state of being. And then her booth was, so booth is my subject, and was is my verb. So like we talked about, to be verbs are going to express a state of being. So present tense to be verbs, I am, you are, he, she, or it is. We are, you are, they are. Past tense, I was, you were, he, she, or it was, we were, you were, they were. And then our future tense for all of our pronouns is going to be will be. I will be, you will be, they will be. So let's look at this picture of the dog. The dog is not doing anything, right? It's just standing there staring at you, being confused. The dog is confused. This is a constant state of being that my dog, Watson, my little Labradoodle, is in. He just is confused constantly. So there are two ways that we can use to be verbs. So the one that you see the most often is as a link to additional information about the subject. So if we look at this picture of this runner, the runner is tired. So what is doing? It's linking to tired. It's giving me more information about the runner, my subject. He's tired. His shoe was untied. Was is giving me additional information. It's acting as a link to untied, which is giving me more information about the shoe. It's untied. All of the sentences that we looked at here are acting as links. So let's look at that real fast. So the screw from Cinder's ankle was rusted. So the additional information, it's giving me more information about the ankle, that it was rusted. It's acting as a link. The hairline threads were stripped clean. So it's giving me more information about the threads. They were stripped clean. Cinder was the only full-service mechanic. So that she was the only full-service mechanic is giving me more information about Cinder. Her booth was in a shady cover between the net screen dealer and the silk merchant. So in a shady cover, and then all of the rest of that between a used net screen dealer and a silk merchant is all additional information about the subject or about her booth. So was in all of these sentences, or was or were in all of these sentences, are acting as a link to additional information about the subject. Usually that's an adjective. To be verbs can also, however, be used to link with, or not as a link, but with another action verb. So let's look at that here. So the runner was yawning. So was is the verb, but yawning is also the verb. So when we use it with a to be verb with another action verb, we're using it to show that the subject is, was, or will be in the process of doing that action. So the runner was yawning when he crossed the finish line. He will trip if he doesn't tie his shoe. So will and trip are both our verbs. I'm using will with an action verb, trip. I'm showing that he will be in the process of tripping if he doesn't actually tie his shoe. So I want you to try this right now. With this picture of this dog, obviously I'm thinking a lot about my dog right now, I want for you to try to write a sentence using a to be verb as a link to additional information about the subject. And then I want you to try using it with an action verb. You can use either present tense or past tense. That's up to you. So pause the video right now and write your sentences in your composition notebook. Okay, let me show you my sentences. So my linking sentence is the dog is happy. Happy is my additional information about my subject, the dog. The dog is happy. Here's my using it with an action verb. The dog is panting. Is my to be verb. I'm using it with panting. So is panting is my whole verb. I'm using it to show that the dog is in the process of panting. Okay, so one of your goals for this week, let's go back there and look at that. One of your goals for this week was to use verbs, to be verbs sparingly in your writing, so use them not very often in your writing. And the reason that I set this as a goal is because as I was doing some reading, remember that we learn from looking at the craft or the writing techniques in books that we're reading. So as I was reading Cinder, I noticed that the author is using hardly any to be verbs. She uses them very rarely in her writing. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to read you these 3 paragraphs. And when I see a action verb, I'm going to underline it in blue. And when I see a to be verb, I'm going to underline it in red. And I want you to notice how much blue there is and how little red there is. Tossing the screwdriver on the table, Cinder gripped her heel and yanked the foot from the socket. A spark singed her fingertips, and she jerked away. The foot dangled from a tangle of red and yellow wires. She slumped back with a relieved groan. A sense of release hovered at the end of those wires. Freedom. Having loathed the too small foot for 4 years, she swore to never put the piece of junk back on again. She just hoped Aiko would be back soon with a replacement. Cinder was, okay, here's our first to be verb. Cinder was the only full-service mechanic at New Beijing Weekly Market. Without a sign, her booth hinted at her trade only by the shelves of stock Android parts that crowded the walls. It was squeezed. So you'll notice that this is actually using it with another action verb. It was squeezed. So it's showing that it is in the presence of being squeezed into a shady cove between a used Netstream dealer and a silk merchant, both of whom frequently complained about the tangy, about the tangy smell of metal and grease that came from Cinder's, I'm missing a C there, Cinder's booth. Okay, I have two sentences that actually have to be verbs in them in these 3 paragraphs. So as you write this week, I do want you to use to be verbs. I want you to use them both, in this case, like as a link to additional information about the subject, as well as with another action verb. It was squeezed, showing that it's in the process of that action. But I want you to use them sparingly. So we should see more action verbs in your writing than to be verbs. Use them wisely, use them sparingly.